and welcome to this three-part series on how to build a root cellar. Now, if you've been following our playlist called The Sustainable House, then you would know that we've built a cellar to store some of our produce which we grow in our gardens. And if you've not seen our Sustainable House playlist, then I would suggest that you do so right away and also subscribe to our channel when you do that. Now, what is a root cellar? A root cellar is basically any kind of a storage location which uses earth to cool itself. Before the advent of refrigerators, root cellars were a very common thing in most farms and homesteads because that's where people store their produce. Now, root cellar is actually quite a Western concept and is used very often in temperate climates where the temperatures reach below freezing during the winter, and therefore the produce has to be kept in a place where it does not freeze. In tropical and subtropical climates like ours, the root cellar behaves a little bit differently because it's not as cold outside as it is in temperate climates. In this video and the other two parts to come, I'll try to explain to you how a root cellar is built, what is the use of having a root cellar, and also the things to watch out for when you're building something like this for yourself. Now, the main advantage of having a root cellar is that if you are growing your own food, a root cellar provides you a space where you can store your produce temporarily or for a long period of time before you consume it or before you take it to market. Even if you don't grow your own food, but you live out of the city or away from the supermarkets, then it's a good place for you to buy things in bulk from the farmer's market or from a supermarket and store them in this environment because you may not have access to a market at a short notice. So it's actually an extension of how to build food security for yourself. You may be growing a lot of food, but honestly, if you're not being able to store it, then you don't really have food security. Because if something happens, like a war breaks out, or there is another pandemic, or there is some other kind of unrest, and you're not able to grow something for a season or two, you must have enough of your own food stored and saved with you so that you can tide over that period without having to run out of food. A root cellar is typically built under the ground because there's an interesting fun fact that no matter what the surface temperature, if you go deep about 3 meters or let's say 10 to 15 feet under the ground, whether you are in a cold climate or you're in a hot climate, you are going to tend to hit the same temperatures underground. And that should be about, I think, like about 15 to 17 degrees is what you will hit as you go down into the ground. That's why in cold climates, sometimes geothermal energy is used to warm up the houses. That geothermal technology is very similar to what happens in a cellar. A cellar is typically built in the northeast of your house, and that's because that tends to be the place which is the coolest. And you can actually build it under one of your rooms, or you can build it as a standalone structure somewhere else. In our case, we've built it as one of the rooms under our kitchen so that we can actually come in here and pick up our produce on a daily basis and go up back again. A few things that need to be kept in mind when you're building a cellar is that the walls of the cellar should actually be good enough as insulation and also thick enough to prevent water and seepage from entering your cellar. We've built walls which actually start at 4 feet wide, right at the bottom. And then at the top of the cellar, they hit a width of 3 feet and actually become contiguous with the rest of the foundation of the house, which is all built in stone and lime and has a 3-foot width. The walls of our cellar are actually built in stone and lime, and the reason we wanted to use lime mortar to build these is because lime is non-toxic, it's breathable, and it creates an environment within the cellar which is very sort of natural and doesn't have the kind of claustrophobic smell that sometimes comes with building with cement. Now, a root cellar can have multiple storage purposes. In our case, we store everything we grow here. So, ranges from the cereals to the pulses to the legumes and to crops like onions and potatoes and turmeric and ginger, root crops basically, and then also vegetables and fruit. Now, these different elements need different kind of storage conditions, and that's the reason that we have a cellar divided into two separate sections. One part of the cellar is lit and has access to the kitchen, and therefore we cannot really seal this off. That's also the part which has some ventilation, and we'll talk about that in the next episode in detail. The other section is actually a dark cellar. That's where there is absolutely no light, and we can store vegetables and fruits which tend to get spoiled on exposure to light. The three things you need to keep in mind when you're building a cellar is that first, a cellar has to be well ventilated. If you don't have continuous circulation of air happening in your cellar, there is likelihood that you will have mold formation. The second thing is that you need to maintain temperatures which are cool and not very warm, because again, if your cellar becomes very hot and it doesn't have enough ventilation, you will again tend to get mold formation. And the third thing is humidity. Now, humidity works really well when your cellar temperatures are low. Like if you live in a temperate climate, your cellar is likely to be anything between 2 to 7 degrees Celsius. Now, that's exactly the temperature of a refrigerator. And in this environment, if you have high humidity as well, then you've actually replicated a refrigerator, and it'll serve you just like any fridge does. But in climates like ours, we never manage to hit those kind of temperatures. So for us, the lowest that we get is about 15 to 17 degrees. And in that temperature, if our humidity becomes really high, then we will tend to get mold formation. But if your humidity is too low, then you will find that your vegetables and fruits are starting to shrink because they are losing their humidity. So how does one maintain humidity in your cellar? Well, by keeping a packed earth floor, which is what we've done in our cellar, it's very easy for us to throw some water on it whenever we feel that our humidity is falling too low, and that helps to raise the humidity levels a little bit. In case you have any kind of seepage into your cellar or have a very high amount of rainfall like we did in the last monsoons, then humidity can become really high, and in unusual circumstances, you may need to put a dehumidifier to actually lower the humidity in the cellar. So remember that the cellar is actually just something which is underground. It reaches a temperature of about, in our climate, about 15 to 25 degrees. And in colder climates, it would be more like maybe, 5 to 10. And this helps you to get some kind of a buffer or some kind of a, extended time period for you to store your fresh produce, but also a nice climate for you to store your non-perishable produce like your legumes and your pulses, etc. Because the temperature variation here is only about 10 degrees over the course of the full year. Now, if I were to keep my wheat or anything else in a hot climate, then my temperature in my area ranges from 5 degrees in the winter to 45 degrees in the summer. So that's a 40-degree temperature variation. So by putting things into the cellar, everything just goes through a 10-degree variation through the year instead of a 40-degree variation. So we'll learn more about the two parts of the cellar in the next episode. So do keep watching.